So we're starting the recording now. And if you did want to follow along, I am in workbook 2 in its conclusion. And it's called Heaven's Gold in a Clay Mold. And it starts out, and I don't want to just read this to you. Typically, I read through it beforehand, and then I just pick out the points that I think would be helpful for the class. There's a lot of good information, so I am kind of reading through this because I've been working on it this morning. Some of the important points in it, and it's a review of workbook 1, where you started out with the 7 days of creation, and you learned or hopefully memorized everything that was created on a specific day, and you learned it in order. In other words, it would be very important for you to know that there was light before there was light, that there was light before there was a sun, a moon, and the stars. Otherwise, you become too focused on the physical rather than saying, hey, from the beginning, there was spiritual light. And we will return to a time when it says that the holy city has no need of a lamp because the lamp is the Lamb. That spiritual light is going to come from within. And so it's a wrap up of those layers, the 7 days of creation. And then we overlaid the 7 spirits of Adonai and learned their characteristics. Then we overlaid the 7 feasts. And then the last thing we did was we overlaid those 7 assemblies, which really wasn't anything new. Once you put together the creation days, the 7 spirits, and the 7 feasts, you've really already got the 7 assemblies of revelation. It's really not a new revelation. It's an old thing coming from eternity, and then it's telling you how it's going to return into eternity, which you might need an attorney, but it will return to eternity either with or without you. Right? It's not a question of whether the Shabbat and the Moedim are eternal. They are. Workbook 1, working through that material, it tells you they are eternal. The only question is, what is our attachment to those things? And as these physical vessels, we've been created in a really awesome way. We're not just spiritual beings. We have a physical ability to enjoy and engage in the spiritual things. And the Torah itself, as it's tying these Moedim together, interspersed with what seems like very mechanical details, are so many prophetic clues. And it tells us, basically, when we celebrate Sukkot, we're celebrating the memory of Passover. When we celebrate Passover, then we're also celebrating Sukkot. That's what you realize is in the circles, there's no beginning and there's no end. He does declare the end from the beginning. So what's been created is going to be recreated. It's going to be restored. It's going to be refreshed. It's going to be healed. And one of the keys, I think, is the river Jordan, or Jordan in English, Jordan. And the root of that, Yerad, it means to come down. And if we think of something else in Revelation that comes down, then we have a landmark. Now we can begin to understand how some things are connected here. Because a Jordan river, the Jordan River, it means to descend or to come down. And who crosses over that Jordan, or in some cases they have departed from Israel, and they're going to have to cross back over the Jordan, the Jordan. They're going to have to come down again, right? And you only cross that Jordan as a nation. You cross it as a people. You cross it as a nation that is holy to Adonai and covered in his sukkah. And so what does it do? It prophesies of a time when New Jerusalem will come down. And if we look at the pattern here, I start with Genesis 33:12, where it's talking about Jacob. But then we're also going to look at when the Israelites go back into the land from Egypt, they have just celebrated Passover. And then they cross over the Jordan. Then they are able to come down once they've celebrated the Passover. Once they have eaten of the barley, the first fruits of the barley from the land, they're able to then yared, or come down. But the first mention is not that Passover crossing. The first mention of a feast is going to be, or in terms of Passover and Sukkot, the first mention is in Genesis 33:12. And if you read verses 12 through 17, you get the bigger picture of what's happening. But the key I wanted to look at is Genesis 33:12 through 17. It says, Jacob journeyed to Sukkot and built for himself a house and made booths, Sukkot, for his livestock. Therefore, the place is named Sukkot. Now, that one little phrase, even in English, is pregnant with prophecy. Jacob journeyed to Sukkot. Sukkot, we know later, was the first stop for the Israelites after they left Egypt at Passover. So Sukkot is not, in its most primitive form, it's not a location. Now, is the ideal to go up to Jerusalem to celebrate Sukkot? Yes, absolutely. In fact, in the Torah, you're told that even before you're told the name of the place. You're told that you're going to have to celebrate Sukkot in a specific location. But until then, do we have prophecies of that place? Yes. We have Jacob who journeys to Sukkot, and he stops and he builds for himself a house. And as you continue reading in Scripture, as you move through the Kings and the Chronicles and move on to Revelation, you realize that the term the house has become a metaphor for the temple, the permanent temple. And as we were talking about last night, I think it was in the after class discussion, that there seems to be a growing from the tabernacle instructions until we get to the temple instructions. There are some distinctions. There are some differences between the tabernacle and the temple. So which one is correct? Yes. The tabernacle was outside of the land at first. It was made outside of the land. But when we look at King Solomon, we can see some differences. Not only has it achieved permanence, it's achieved things like pillars, and some things have multiplied. For instance, the menorah itself. There's only one menorah in the tabernacle. But what we realize in King Solomon's temple, the house that he built, it says for the Lord, you've got 5 menorot, 5 menorahs down this side. You've got 5 down this side, right? And so basically what have you got there? You've got 10, right? So he's multiplying. And in fact, if you take those 10 and you multiply them times the 7 branches, then I think, it's been a while since I've had to do really difficult math, but 10 times 7 would be 70, which is the representative number of the nations. And Solomon's the one who prays at the inauguration, at the dedication of this temple, with the 70 among the menorot. You know, even when a Gentile, even when those from the nations turn toward this your house. When they stretch out your hands toward this your house and they pray, hear them and answer them. So what are we getting right here in this very primitive prophecy of Genesis of the temple? Well, we have a clue, the house, and then he says he made tabernacles, or he makes Sukkot for the livestock. Therefore, the place is named Sukkot. If you were to study workbook 4, you would see more prophecy embedded in the idea that he built for himself a house and he made tabernacles for the livestock. Because the pattern that we have is every time the patriarchs come through a tribulation, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, every time they come through a tribulation, they're multiplying in livestock. And as we were studying the Torah portion, Lekha last night, what we saw is it says that Abraham made souls in Haran. In other words, there was evangelism going on even in Haran, which is a hot, dry place. That's what that root means. So Abraham, basically in the infancy of his call, he starts making souls right then. And as he goes, he's increasing in livestock to the point where in the Torah portion, there's struggle between Abraham and Lot because there's so much livestock, there's not room for both of them to graze their cattle. So what increases with the patriarchs? What increases in Israel? It's livestock. And in that study, it shows how the livestock come to represent people, the nations who will join with Israel. And Egypt, a mixed multitude, went out from Egypt with them. When Jacob left Haran, he left with a lot of livestock. Isaac increases in livestock. Jacob, just like we can see right here, he has gone to Haran. He has also increased in livestock in a dry, hot place, in a type of a wilderness, if we want to look at the place name, in a place that would be difficult to increase. But that's what we saw in Egypt, that the more they were oppressed, the greater their increase. The more they suffered, the more afflicted they were, the greater the fruit. And so what we have here are some metaphors: the house, the temple, Sukkot, livestock, the nations coming up under the sukkah. Therefore, he says the place is named Sukkot. And we know that in the Jewish tradition, Sukkot is known as the Feast of the Nations. And so he builds a house. A house is something that's more permanent, but then he builds temporary Sukkot for the cattle. And it was in this place that we see Jacob experienced tribulation. And it's especially, you can read it in the Hebrew if you'll read it that way. But when Dinah is raped and Shimon and Levi put the entire male population of Shechem to the sword, Jacob talks about this tribulation that he's having, that this tzara. And he even goes so far, he says, "You've made me odious in this land. You have brought so much tribulation upon me." So that's the first hint that we have of Jacob's trouble. So what is this Sukkot? Well, it doesn't have to be a certain place when we're looking at the Torah as prophecy, because Sukkot is a city east of the Jordan, east of Yared, and it's also a place in Egypt. So both of these places are outside of the land of Israel. But these were both, shall we call them, pit stops for Israel, exiting tribulation from Haran, exiting tribulation from Egypt. And there's going to be prophecy later that we'll read that deals very specifically, that points out Egypt. When it says, if the nations don't come up, they're not going to get any rain. And then it doesn't stop right there. It mentions Egypt by name, which is no accident. There's never any accidents in Scripture. It's called smichut. What did I put there and why did I put it there? So that you would pay attention to it. So our first two Sukkot that we can see celebrated or mentioned by name are outside of the land and outside of Jerusalem. So in Egypt, they would have been camping at Sukkot during Passover. That's why it's so important to understand the chiastic structure of Scripture. Let me get my menorah. Because if we look at this menorah, okay, one of these is Passover and one of these is Sukkot. Doesn't matter which side. If I were to bend this menorah on itself, fold it right here in the middle, which two feasts are going to touch? Well, at that point, Passover has now touched or become one with Sukkot. And when we studied the rivers of Eden, we could see why that would be so easy, because this outer river, the Pishon, if it's going around and around, then Passover and Sukkot have no beginning and no end. And that's why, like with the spirit of wisdom, spirit of reverence, the spirit of reverence is the beginning of all wisdom. Passover is the beginning of Sukkot, is the beginning of Passover, is the beginning of Sukkot, is the beginning of Passover. That's how chiastic structure works. We have to practice sometimes breaking out a chronological study and start to use the patterns the Bible uses. Even though it's easier to pick up chronological, once you see the beauty of a chiasm, you'll start to see them everywhere. It's important, especially when we're looking at these examples right here, that we have a Passover that's actually embedded into a Sukkot. They come out of Egypt at Passover. They're still in the week of unleavened bread. And so they're in Sukkot at Passover. And it says in Exodus 12:35, it says, "Now the sons of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, for they had requested from the Egyptians articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing." Silver, gold, clothing. They got it from the Egyptians. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have their request. Thus, they plundered the Egyptians. Now the sons of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Sukkot, about 600,000 men on foot. There's our 6, aside from children. And a mixed multitude also went up with them, along with flocks and herds, a very large number of livestock. So what do we have in common here? Well, with Jacob, who observed a primitive Sukkot, he had a lot of livestock, and he built Sukkot for them. When the Israelites leave Egypt, they have a very large number of livestock, and they camp at Sukkot. It says about 600,000 men on foot. And that's what you'll see is often a juxtaposition of the man and the beast. Especially like in the book of Jonah, it wasn't just the man that fasted in sackcloth and ashes when they were preached repentance. It said even the cattle were going to fast in sackcloth and ashes. You think, how odd? But it's not odd. It's that oddity is to show you this similarity between the man and the beast. And again, it's about that decision. The 666, the 6 itself, the day that the man and the beast were both created. So you have to decide at every Passover and every Sukkot, am I conforming to the image of the beast in this coming year? Or have I conformed to the image of the beast in this past year? You get bookends there for reflection. So the beast is always there to remind you of who you are in Messiah. But just remember, they took articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing or coverings. Clothing and coverings are equivalent expressions in many cases. And that takes us to another reference. We're looking for a place where silver, gold, and coverings appear together. Well, we have 2 Kings 16:8. It says, Ahaz took the silver and the gold that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house, and sent a present to the king of Assyria. And we know in hindsight, this eventually led to destruction. All right, Assyria eventually thought, hey, if you've got that much good stuff, then we'll come get the rest of your good stuff too. But it started off with compromise and sending presents to a pagan country. So we've got silver and gold that was in the treasury of the king's house. Silver and gold in the treasury of the house of the Lord. Can you see the equivalent expression there? Can you see Adonai as the king and using those two things to show you one picture? And then we go on to 16:18, 2 Kings 16:18. It says, the covered way for the Sabbath, which they had built in the house. In other words, Ahaz didn't stop at giving up the silver and gold that was found in the temple as a present to a pagan king. He goes even farther. What is he trying to do? He's trying to appease. He's trying to compromise. He's trying to save his skin, basically, trying to save his kingdom. It says the covered way for the Sabbath, which they had built in the house, and the outer entry of the king, he removed from the house of the Lord because of the king of Assyria. Now, if you do a lot of reading in the prophets, you'll know that in books like Isaiah, you'll have parables where a prophet will address a succession of kings. And so you know that the prophecy cannot be literal because those kings did not live in the same time period. But he's using each of those kings as a parable, as an example of the wicked lamp, of a wicked spirit. So when King Ahaz, an Israelite king, removes the covered way for the Shabbat, we understand that he has also given away the silver and the gold vessels of the temple to a pagan king. At this point, we can't say he's a righteous king. He's now become wicked, King Ahaz. Where did those silver and gold vessels come from? Well, they had come from King Solomon. He is the one who had ordered the casting of the temple vessels. David had collected the goods for the building, but it was given to Solomon to complete the job. So he cast the silver and gold vessels. He cast those bronze pillars. He casts all this consecrated silver and gold according to the plans of his father David. And here's the description in 1 Kings. This is before things go bad. 1 Kings 7:46. It says, in the plain of the Jordan, there's the river we're looking for, Jordan, something that comes down, and it's something that we have to cross over. The king cast them. It's talking about the vessels of the temple. In the clay ground between Sukkot and Sartan. Right? We are made of clay. So you can see prophecy all in this. You can see double meanings, sometimes triple meanings, all through here. So being cast in a plain of the Jordan, in clay ground, in people. We are jars of clay. And it's by place between Sukkot and Sartan. It says, Solomon left all the utensils unweighed because they were too many. The weight of the bronze could not be ascertained. Solomon made all the furniture which was in the house of the Lord, the golden altar and the golden table on which was the bread of the presence, the lampstands, 5 on the right side and 5 on the left, in front of the inner sanctuary of pure gold, and the flowers and the lamps and the tongs of gold, and the cups and the snuffers and the bowls and the spoons and the fire pans of pure gold, and the hinges both for the doors of the inner house, the most holy place, and for the doors of the house, that is of the nave, of gold. Remember our good gold from Bereshit? We're seeing it again. It says, thus, all the work that King Solomon performed in the house of the Lord, this is the temple, was finished. And Solomon brought in the things dedicated by his father David, the silver and the gold and the utensils, and he put them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. So we have this idea of casting these vessels and the things dedicated by his father David, which, by the way, was considered the golden age of the Ger, the stranger in Israel, because we see David had a practice of incorporating like-minded people in his administration from the nations. He might have a Hittite working for him if that Ger, if that stranger was of like mind and was willing to live under the covenant that Israel lived. In fact, that's even under discussion today in Orthodox circles. They're asking that question, do we need to go back to the time of David and Solomon and rethink what constitutes a stranger and how we treat that stranger, how we even define that stranger? It's very exciting to see what they're doing. But we see this root of the city Sartan. We know about Sukkot on one side, but the other side of the casting is Sartan. And there you can see that root of tsar, which means tribulation or trouble, distress, a narrow place. And Mitzrayim, Egypt, it has the same root. Mitzrayim, the means by which the tribulations are accomplished. The tribulations are from the tribulations. Different ways you can look at that construct, but definitely the root of it is tribulations. So Solomon is casting between Sukkot, basically, and the tribulations that we would associate with Egypt, or Mitzrayim from Sartan. So casting silver and gold vessels, as well as those bronze pillars, they were cast in clay molds between tribulation, which can be represented by Egypt and Passover, and Sukkot. So what is it saying? Our appointed time to be cast as a pillar in the temple of Adonai, as a silver or gold vessel, remember, that was released, that was taken out of Egypt, the livestock that were released from Haran and came down with Jacob to dwell in Sukkot. We are part of that. We are going to be cast between Passover and Sukkot. So what is a sukkah? Well, it can mean a thicket, like with plants and things. It can mean to hide something that's covert. It can mean a very primitive shelter. But the root of it, sakak, which if we go back to sokek, that means a covered structure, like a sukkah. And if we look at the verb form of sakak, then in Exodus, in 37:9, and then 1 Chronicles 28:18, what we realize is in this putting together of the temple and the tabernacle, that the wings of the cherubim on the ark, that they were to sakak the mercy seat. They were to sakak the throne. So what's going on here? The word for sukkah or Sukkot has a relevance to that covered area of the Ark of the Covenant, a place we're not allowed to go. So when we're dwelling in Sukkot, can it be that the deception is that it seems like it's only a bunch of twigs and branches, that it's only a holiday? Not exactly. There's something intensely holy, something intensely prophetic going on when we dwell in Sukkot. Figuratively, we're dwelling under the wings of the cherubim, because those are the wings that covered the mercy seat or the throne. So in 2 Kings 16:18, where it's talking about this covered way for the Sabbath that King Ahaz took down, it's one of those wordplay words. It only depends on how you pronounce it, what it means. Because it says the covered way for the Shabbat, if instead of saying Shabbat, we say Shebet, only changing the vowels, which weren't there to begin with, which is from Yeshav, which means basically to sit, which is where you get the idea of a throne. Then we could also translate that phrase, not just that he removed the covered way for the Sabbath, we could say that he removed the covered place of the throne after he removed the silver and gold vessels of the temple and gave them away to a pagan altar. They were taken away to be offered to pagan gods. And in fact, what did the king of Assyria do? He set another altar, a pagan altar, beside the altar of Adonai. So we've got a play on word here. Did King Ahaz remove the covered way of the throne, or the covered place of the throne, or did he remove the covered way for the Sabbath? Yes. It's giving us, like I said, smichut. When he places a certain word in a certain place, it makes us ask a question. Is it this or is it that? But both things may be true. Regardless of how you translate it, you're left with the same truth. That this wicked king Ahaz, who removed the covering of the Sabbath, he removed the covering of the throne. He removed the covering of Sukkot. Sukkot is that great Sabbath. And why? Because he decided to align himself with the king of Assyria, which in the parables of Isaiah, he's a type of Antichrist. And Antichrist is one who is against the Messiah, who is against the living Torah. So if you want to put the spirit of anti-Messiah to work in Israel, and if Israel's the lamp for the rest of the world, for the rest of the nations, remove Israel's covering of the Shabbat, and you're going to subvert the reign of the Holy One. You're going to subvert the reign of Messiah, because Israel's rest is in Messiah Yeshua. He's one and the same with our Shabbat from the beginning. So how did the light, how is it removed from the world? Well, in this case, you convince a king that in order to save his own skin, in order to assimilate with the ways of the nations, then what will I do? I will give up the covered way of the Sabbath. But at the very same time that you give up the covered way of the Sabbath, you're giving up the covering, the place of the throne in your life. And that's what Israel did. That's what leads eventually to their deportation. The people they thought they were making friends with. See, you can't make friends with Sunday. I'm sorry. You cannot compromise that truth. Because when you allow the distinction between Shabbat and Sunday, or Friday and Shabbat, or any other day of the week and Shabbat, when you allow that to be clouded, you have done exactly like wicked King Ahaz. You have removed the covered way of the Sabbath, and you have removed the place of the throne from your life. And therefore, no one can look at you and see light. It's a subversion. It's allowing a spirit of Antichrist to work through you. What does it say? Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of Shabbat. Can you see Elohim as the creator on that first week of our history? He's worked for 6 days, creating the earth. And on Friday evening, he sits on his throne of Shabbat, and he is covered by the cherubim. And we can sit down with him. We can sit right down there, and we can play around his feet on Shabbat. We can be under the sukkah, the covered way of Shabbat, the covered way of the throne. We can be right there at his feet. If we obey the king's righteousness, and we're not perverting the justice of the Shabbat throne, then we can enjoy that rest. We can enjoy that peace right there at the feet of the king. But see, if we don't, if we disobey, and we remove the covered way of the throne, and we remove the place of Shabbat in our lives, then where is he supposed to put his feet? Because he says in Isaiah 66, he says, heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. Where then is the house you could build for me? Where's the temple you're going to build? Think about it. Where's the place that I may rest? He says, for my hand made all these things. Thus all these things came into being. But to this one I will look, to him who is humble and contrite of spirit and who trembles at my word. What word? Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. How about that for a word? How about that for a covered way of the throne? So if on the first Shabbat Elohim ceased from his labor and sat on his throne of Shabbat, then what happened? He joined heaven and earth in a mutual rest. He's sitting on his throne in the heavens, and his feet are on the earth, resting, a footstool. You don't run around doing things with your feet on a footstool. You rest. It says, I'm not working. It says, I just want to sit here and enjoy you for a while, just the way you did with your children and your grandchildren. Let me just sit down here and watch you play around my feet. But see, if there is no Sabbath, it makes no sense for him to be sitting on the throne in heaven and his feet to be running all over the place on earth. The earth is his footstool. And so if his majesty is resting in heaven, then his feet should also be resting on earth on Shabbat. His will should be done on earth as it is in heaven. And you say, well, I think you're taking that out of context. Well, let's go to the end of the chapter of Isaiah 66. He says, I will also take some of them for priests and for Levites, says the Lord, for just as the new heavens and the new earth which I make will endure before me, declares the Lord, so your offspring and your name will endure. And it shall be from one new moon to another, and from one Shabbat to another, all mankind will come to bow down before me, says the Lord. Excuse me. The context is Shabbat. When he's saying, where's the place that I may rest? What are you going to build for me? He wants us to rebuild Shabbat on earth so his feet have a place to rest. A planet without Shabbat rest, or this priesthood that he's talking about, who will teach about Shabbat, who will teach about the feast, who will teach the commandments of Adonai, a planet without these things will not endure forever. It's just like we read about Hamas in the Torah portion, Noach. He said, her priests have done violence to my Torah. They've profaned my holy things. They've made no distinction between the holy and the profane. They have not taught the difference between the unclean and the clean, and they're hiding their eyes from my Sabbaths. So, if he has priests who are doing violence to his Torah by hiding their eyes from his Sabbaths, then he says, I will take from among them for priests. I made something out of nothing, and I can find priests who will restore the covered way of the throne for the Sabbath, who will allow me to be seated on my throne in heaven and rest my feet on earth. And it's up to us to establish that distinction. If we're not making and proclaiming that distinction between Shabbat and every other day, we're doing the same violence that those priests did. The world has to have a menorah. And that menorah is what separates light from darkness. We have to be those men and women in our generation who go and we retrieve those bronze pillars and the silver and the gold vessels that were sold out many years ago to Egypt. And it doesn't matter whether the leaders that did that were wicked or just misguided. It matters not. It matters that we know where to find the silver and the gold vessels. It matters that we know where to find those pillars that actually belong in the temple. They've been scattered out there among the nations. Well, it's time that we tell these clay vessels that clay is broken. Clay will pass away. But the silver and gold that he's talking about will endure forever. It's good gold. It's pillars. It says you will go no more out from my temple. And what does he compare the pillars to? He says the Moedim. He says, I have set these pillars. And what is a pillar? Amud. It's something that endures. How will we endure? We'll endure with Shabbat. We'll endure with the Moedim, but not with just the letter. Because what does it say? Moth and dust will corrupt an earthly metal. But a spiritual metal, good gold, from the rivers of Eden, that will endure forever. And it's interesting, the verb Sukkot is spelled exactly the same way as the plural of Sukkah or Sukkot, the biblical way. Its definition is to be silent. And it occurs only in Deuteronomy 27, 8 through 10. It says, you shall write on the stones all the words of this Torah very distinctly. Then Moses and the Levitical priests spoke to all Israel, saying, be silent and listen, O Israel, this day. You have become a people for the Lord your God. You shall therefore obey the Lord your God and do his commandments and his statutes, which I command you today. So this silence, he says, be silent and listen. Sukkot. It accompanies a revelation that on this day, you are becoming a people for Adonai. Ha'am Adonai is what it says. You say, well, they'd already become a people back at Sinai. Yes, but he's reaffirming, because what are they going to do now? They are about to cross over the Yarden. You cannot come down in New Jerusalem until you have crossed over the Yarden. That celebration of Sukkot, it's hinting at something. In spite of all the noise and the joy and everything that happens, during the week of Sukkot, that 8th day high Sabbath that's added onto that last day that's separate but attached. Adonai said it's supposed to be a Sabbath rest to us. He always says, these are my feasts. But in this sense, he says, it's a Sabbath to you. It's your rest. It's your final rest in Messiah's kingdom. It's not temporary anymore. You don't go in the sukkah. But there's going to be a Sukkot that's associated with this revelation. Where do you find it? You find it in Revelation 7:13. It says, one of the elders answered, saying to me, these who are clothed in the white robes, who are they? Where did they come from? I said to him, my Lord, you know. And he said to me, these are the ones who come out of the great tribulation. And they have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. For this reason, they are before the throne of God, and they serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne shall spread his tabernacle over them. It's the same things that we've just read in the Torah, in the prophets. We're coming out of a great tribulation. We're coming out of Mitzrayim. We're coming out of Sartan. And he says, I'm going to return you. You're going to be before the throne and serve him day and night in his temple, in his house, his permanent house. And it says, he who sits on the throne shall spread his sukkah, his tabernacle over them. The covered way of the throne will be restored. The covered way of the Sabbath will be restored in this temple that will come down. He says, they shall hunger no more, neither thirst any more, neither shall the sun beat down on them, nor any heat. For the Lamb in the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and shall guide them to the springs of the water of life. Remember Yeshua standing up at Sukkot and talking about the rivers that are going to run through us? And it says, and God shall wipe every tear from their eyes. And when he broke the seventh, the Sabbath seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. There's the Sukkot. There's the silence of Sukkot. There's 30 minutes of silence for the covered way of the throne, for the restoration of the Shabbat and that covering, that tabernacle that he spreads over us. How in the world can he spread his tabernacle over us when we will not gather at his footstool on Shabbat? Where would we rather be? A soccer match or at his footstool? Where would we rather be? A football game or at his footstool? There's 1.5 million other places we can be on Shabbat, but I want to be at his footstool because I want to be part of that 30 minutes of Sukkot in heaven, in a heavenly temple, at the breaking of the Shabbat seal. Remember what Moses says, be silent and listen, O Israel, this day you have become a people for the Lord your God. You shall therefore obey the Lord your God and do his commandments and his statutes, which I command you today. The book of Revelation is just full of pleas to the congregations of Israel to keep the testimony of Yeshua, which is the commandments of Elohim. How many times does it say the people who have what? The testimony of Yeshua and the commandments of God. It points back to our corporate identity as the people of Israel, a people over whom a sukkah is spread by one sitting on the covered throne in the temple, the house of Adonai. Their robes are made white by the blood of the Passover lamb. They came out of Mitzrayim, silver and gold. They came out of great distress. They came out of Egypt. They came out of Jacob's trouble. They came out of the tribulation. So, I know we're running out of time and we still got a lot of material to cover, but we did have a little bit of introduction time, so I'm going to run a little over. If you've got to go to work or you've got something else to do, that's fine, but I'm going to continue on because I think this is important. Starting on our new cycle, having come to the end of the Sukkot, which was actually our beginning, I think we have to resolve today that we are going to keep Shabbat, that we are going to gather at his footstool. And if we go back and we look at that pouring out in the Adamah is the earth between Sukkot and Sartan. We are that earth, but we're also the silver and the gold and the bronze for the temple that the king cast in earthen molds. So whatever the Spirit is doing in us, he's doing it in this Adamah, in this earth that we call our physical bodies. He's allowing this refining process, this molding process to take place in these human bodies. And it's taking place between Sukkot and Sartan. Again, like a Passover. And remember, this is where in the Jordan Valley, the river parted for Israel to pass over to conquer Canaan. They've ended their wilderness journey, and they've changed leadership from Moshe to Yehoshua. They've circumcised their males, and they celebrated Passover just before the waters of the Jordan parted, just like those of the Reed Sea parted after the first Passover. So we've got Passover, Passover. This is where the waters part at Sartan. And Yeshua teaches us about this. He says in Luke 13:22, it says, and he was passing through from one city and village to another, teaching, proceeding on his way to Jerusalem, the place where you would celebrate Passover and Sukkot. And someone said to him, Lord, are there just a few who are being saved? And he said to them, strive to enter by the narrow door, for many, I tell you, will seek to enter and will not be able. Once the head of the house gets up and shuts the door, remember the house is a metaphor of the temple. Once the head of the house gets up and shuts the door, and you begin to stand outside and knock on the door saying, Lord, open up to us. And he will answer and say to you, I don't know where you're from. And you'll begin to say, we ate and we drank in your presence and you taught in our streets. And he will say, I tell you, I don't know where you're from. Depart from me, all you evil doers. So when we say eating and drinking and teaching in the streets, making our way to Jerusalem, that should make you think of Sukkot. If you've ever been in Jerusalem at Sukkot, that still goes on. Eating and drinking and teaching in the streets. And what city is paired with Sukkot? When you cast the silver and gold vessels for the temple in Jerusalem? Sartan, which means a narrow place. Right? And that's what Yeshua says, strive to enter by the narrow door. In Mitzrayim, they had to put blood on a doorpost. Why? Because tribulation was starting. They were being squeezed into a narrow place. He says, go through that narrow door. Go through that door of Passover. And follow that narrow path all the way to Sartan and to Sukkot. And when you do that, when you follow these feasts from Passover to Sukkot, then there are things that are going to happen in this physical Adamah of your body. There's going to be a transformation of the spirit. And you are going to suffer distress. You are going to feel like you're in a narrow place. But he says, I'm giving you this distress and this trouble to form you into something that is suitable to be inside the temple, not outside knocking on the door saying, let me in. I celebrated Sukkot. If you're not doing it without the power of the Holy Spirit, then who did you do it for? How can he know you? If you didn't suffer distress and tribulation for Passover and Sukkot, then have you really celebrated Passover and Sukkot? Trust me, those times a year, the chametz comes looking for you. And you will have all kinds of ushpizin in your life at Sukkot, your challenges. He's going to give you distress and trouble at these times to form you, to present to you that narrow way to come in. Nehemiah 13:16, it says, also the men of Tyre were living there who imported fish. Remember, they just returned from Babylon in this passage. Who imported fish. And who do the fish represent? The Gentiles. And all kinds of merchandise, and sold them to the sons of Judah on the Shabbat, even in Jerusalem. Then I reprimanded the nobles of Judah and said to them, what's this evil thing you're doing by profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers do the same, so that our God brought on us and on this city all this trouble, this distress, this tribulation? Yet you were adding to the wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. Revelation should have just opened up another layer of context for you. The wrath of the Lamb. He says, you are adding to the wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. Who gets the wrath started? Does God wake up one day and says, let's start the wrath of the Lamb? Or are we provoking it? Are we adding to the wrath on Israel by profaning the Shabbat? And it came about that just as it grew dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Shabbat, I commanded that the doors should be shut and that they should not open them until after the Sabbath. Now does Yeshua's parable make sense? Then I stationed some of my servants at the gates, that no load should enter on the Sabbath day. You shouldn't be buying and selling on the Sabbath day. That's just what Revelation says. It didn't invent something new. Revelation is reiterating what the prophet Nehemiah wrote. Once or twice, the traders and merchants of every kind of merchandise spent the night outside Jerusalem, and I warned them and said to them, why do you spend the night in front of the wall? If you do so again, I'll use force against you. From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come as gatekeepers to sanctify the Sabbath day. That is exactly what Revelation is teaching us. We have to become those Levites. We have to become those gatekeepers to make holy, to sanctify the Sabbath day, because it's not as if it's not holy already. The Holy One made it holy. It's the first thing he called holy. Not an object, not a place, a space of time. He calls holy. So it's holy. The only question is, will I also sanctify it? Will I do it? And therefore, will I be eligible to enter the city while he spreads his sukkah over me so that I can play at his feet and enjoy that rest of Shabbat? Or will I be outside the city, bang, bang, bang? I got something to sell. That might be a good place to start. Let me see if I had added some references in here that I thought would be important. And like I say, any of you that have the old workbook one, when I get this off to Stacy and we get it formatted, then I could probably just make you a PDF and email you the updated version. But basically what the rest of it does is it kind of goes through the warning to the assembly of Laodicea. And, it says, I advise you to buy from me gold refined by fire, that you may become rich. Those whom I love, I reprove, I discipline. Be zealous, therefore, and repent. And actually, at the Council of Laodicea, that's where we have the text that sets aside the Sabbath day for the church. They were warned by John, but in 363 AD, their canon reads, Christians must not Judaize by resting on the Shabbat, but must work on that day, rather honoring Sunday, the Lord's Day. That's what they're calling it. And if they can, resting then as Christians. But if any shall be found to be Judaizers, let them be anathema from Christ. Canon 37 through 39 of the Council of Laodicea says it's not lawful to receive portions sent from the feasts of the Jews or heretics, nor to feast together with them. There goes Sukkot. It's not lawful to receive unleavened bread from the Jews, nor to be partakers of their impiety. There went Passover. You shall not keep feasts with Hebrews or heretics, nor receive festival offerings from them. There went Shavuot. And it says, light has no communion with darkness. Therefore, no Christian should celebrate a feast with heretics or Jews. Neither should he receive anything connected with these feasts, such as unleavened bread and the like. So, about 300 years after John prophesied in the book of Revelation and warned them, the Laodiceans prohibited the very Sabbath, the very feasts of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, the disciples of Yeshua kept and should continue to keep if we desire to keep his testimony and his commandments. It's heavy. I say this workbook too really begins with this. It begins with heaven's gold in a clay mold. Because Laodicea was told a time would come when they would believe they were being obedient. And clothes are the symbol of obedience. In the beginning, when they disobeyed, what did they realize? I'm naked. I need to clothe myself because I no longer have these clothes of the light of the Torah. And so they had to settle for animal skin. So clothes represent your obedience to the commandments. And Laodicea is told there's going to come a time when you think you have your clothes on, that you think you're being obedient, but you're actually naked to the point of shame. And disobedience to the gospel will reveal our nakedness. These works were prepared for us to walk in. And I think it kind of goes back to what I was talking about with the Monday night class that I learned at Sukkot, just like, the first teaching was what I had put out in those Torah tip sheets. You have to plan. Walking this walk is planning to walk this walk. You don't meander through life. When you're in covenant, your steps, it says, are ordered of the Lord. You know every year where your feet are supposed to be on the seventh day. You know every year where your feet are supposed to be at Passover and unleavened bread and first fruits of the barley and the first fruits of the wheat and the Feast of Trumpets and Yom Kippur and Sukkot. You know exactly where your feet are supposed to be. Those steps are ordered. You've got a lot of creativity within those footsteps. He wants you to enjoy them. He wants you to play around his footstool on his feasts because he's got you covered. He really does. It feels like we're in tribulation. It feels like we're in distress, but we all know what a feeling is. A 50% chance of a lie. Right? So, like I said, I know some of you have to go. We went a little bit over today. I am going to stop the recording here.